Welcome back, guys. In this video, we're going to be studying imperialism, but specifically in China and India. If you guys remember, we just did Africa, and the definition of imperialism is the taking over of one country by another to extend their influence. There were hundreds of reasons for imperialism, why these countries were going out and taking over other lands. One of the major reasons was just to get resources. Okay, with the Industrial Revolution, people needed a place to get coal, to get whatever materials or resources it was that they needed to drive their machines. Some people even tried to justify it and say that, we have so much technology that we need to go out to these places, to Africa, to China, to other parts of Asia, to India, to teach these people about, one, Catholicism, Christianity. Two, they thought that they had to show them all the technology and new ways of life that they've discovered because these people didn't have that. We talked about some of the resistance that Africans gave against Great Britain, against France, against the Dutch in Africa, and that same resistance or drive for these people to fight against the foreigners is going to happen in China and India as well. Okay, but it's not always successful resistance. Here we have a map of imperialism in the modern world in 1900, and if you take a look at the color here, this whole section of Northwest Africa is owned by France. Okay, so they've come in from over here and taken over this whole section of Africa, which is about 10 times the size of their own country. If you look at Great Britain, there's a quote that people say, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Okay, and what they mean by that is you have little Great Britain here. They own all this section of Canada. They own India. They own Australia. They own all these different parts of Africa, including Egypt and the Suez Canal. All right, so anywhere in the world, at some point, the sun is always up. Okay, there's a place that Great Britain owns that they can see the sun at all times. Here's a definition of imperialism that you should know. Imperialism is a domination by one country of the political, economic, or cultural life of another country or region. It's between 1500 and 1800 that European states are going to go out and start winning empires around the world. Europe had little influence on the lives of the people of these conquered lands. By the 1800s, Europe had gained considerable power. Encouraged by the new economic and military strength, Europeans embarked on a path of aggressive expansion that today's historians call the new imperialism. Here's the three areas that we're going to be focusing on. Africa is going to be taken over. You saw that in the map just before. India and China are going to be carved up mostly by Great Britain, but some other countries have some influence in China as well, which they'll set up spheres of influence. The first area we're going to take a look at is China. China had always, throughout history, experienced a favorable balance of trade, which means they were exporting more than they were importing. Okay, so they're going to get very rich through this. Well, when Great Britain arrives on their doorstep with a whole bunch of trading boats in the 1830s, they decide, hey, wouldn't it be better if Britain traded more to China? Okay, and they exported more of their products than Chinese had to buy them. All right, so they need to think of a way to make this possible because the Chinese did not like to import more than they exported. So the genius idea that the British come up with is to sell them opium, okay, which is a drug that they're going to become highly addicted to, and pretty much be forced to continue to buy it because of this addiction. Sure enough, the Chinese officials and traders do not like the sale of opium in their countries, and what they try to do is ban the use of opium, ban the British from trading with them. And when the British hear of this, they come in with their war boats, okay, and all these ships, and they come into the ports and they have a war with the Chinese. It's known as the Opium War, and China didn't stand a chance against the industrial power of Great Britain. So after two opium wars, it was clear that China had lost, and they set up a treaty. Okay, this is an agreement between two countries after a war, and what the treaty said was that China was now completely controlled by these foreign powers, specifically Great Britain. To sum it up, the Chinese got very addicted to the opium and very angry over the sale of it from the government. So they had the Opium War, which turned out to be a failure for the Chinese and a success for Great Britain. Okay, and after that, China was in a bit of a crisis. Okay, where they're going to experience a rebellion and the overthrow of the current dynasty in China. Here are some of the internal problems going on in the 1800s during the Qin dynasty. One, irrigation systems and canals are poorly maintained, okay, which is going to lead to massive flooding. There is a huge population explosion that had begun a century earlier, which is creating terrible hardship for the Chinese peasants. There's an extravagant court, tax evasion by the rich, and widespread official corruption added to the peasants' burden. The civil service system was rocked by bribery scandals. And between 1815 and 1864, peasants took part in the Taiping Rebellion, the most devastating revolt in history. By 1914, it wasn't just Great Britain who was imperializing China. Okay, countries from all over Europe were sailing over to China and try to set up their influence and take over certain sections of China for their own benefit. Okay, you can see here that the French have influence, the Russians to the north, the Japanese have influence over here by Manchuria, and the Germans have influence as well as the British. The Taiping Rebellion occurred in 1850. 20 million people are going to die during this rebellion that's going to last 14 years. The Manchus defeated the rebellion after 14 years of fighting with the help of the British military, and the Qing dynasty was placed back to the throne. The Qing dynasty would not last long. As the century ended, anger grew against foreigners in China. In the Boxer Rebellion, angry Chinese attacked foreigners across China. In response, Western powers and Japan crushed the Boxers. Okay, the Boxers are basically a group of people who hate any foreign influence, and they're going to attack any foreigners who would appear in China. Defeat at the hands of foreigners led China to embark on a rush of reforms. Chinese nationalists called for a constitutional monarchy, or republic. When Empress Qixi died in 1908, China slipped into chaos. In 1911, the Qing dynasty was toppled. Sun Yat-sen was named president of the new Chinese Republic. Sun wanted to rebuild China on the three principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and economic security for all Chinese. Here's a picture of the Boxers and some of the resistance to imperialism in China. Again, another group of these Boxers who are going to try and fight against all resistance. Overall, for China, imperialism carved them up into several different sections that other countries took over and would set up their own trading rules and their own trading rights. So imperialism was pretty devastating for the Chinese. By 1900, Britain controlled 1/5 of the world's territory, including Australia, Canada, and India, and of course sections of China. The empire upon which the sun never set, possible to travel around the world by railroad and sea, and moving only through British territories. The next place we're going to take a look at is the relationship of England and India. The British East India Company is the name of the company that's going to come in from England to India and set up the takeover of this country. Right, one of the main purposes of England going to India is to get raw materials and to sell their finished goods to India. So you can see Great Britain over here would go through the Mediterranean Sea and then through the Suez Canal, okay, down the Red Sea and into the Arabian Sea over to India. So it was very important for Great Britain to control this area to make travel easy. So they took over parts of Egypt in Africa, took control of this canal, and had their direct route to India. Okay, they could then continue to travel around to China. Sepoys were Indian soldiers that were actually fighting for the British. So the British would take Indians in India and have them become part of their army. The Sepoys eventually had a rebellion over the use of gun cartridges, which were made from a cow fat, which they didn't want to put into their mouths because part of their Hindu religion said that the cow was holy. Okay, so they said that they would refuse to bite these gun cartridges in the military, and because of this, there was a mutiny and a mass killing of the Sepoys by the British. There was an insurrection of Hindu and Muslim soldiers in the British Army, which spread in northern and central India before it was crushed, primarily by loyal native troops from southern India. After 1858, Indian ruled by British Parliament in London and administered by a tiny all-white civil service in India. Some of the reforms in India, some of the good things that Great Britain did for this area was One, a modern system of progressive secondary education. Okay, secondary schools for children. They train them in civil servants to become civil servants, in economic reforms, how to use irrigation systems. They brought railroads, tea, and several other plantations. They also created and unified a powerful state of India. Here we take a closer look at the British East India Company and their interactions with the Indians. This is a picture of the sepoys working with the British soldiers here, which led to the huge sepoy rebellion. Here's the causes of and effects. Okay, the British East India Company does these things. Requires sepoys or Indian soldiers in its service, including overseas, to do these things which violate Hindu religious law. Okay, which included they made a law which Hindus widows allowed them to marry, which undermined Hindu beliefs. They ordered sepoys to bite off cartridges made of animal fat when loading their rifles. Okay, some of the effects: sepoys brutally massacred British men. Okay, they take up arms and they're going to fight against the British. The British took terrible revenge, slaughtering thousands of unarmed Indians. Both sides were left with a bitter legacy of fear, hatred, and mistrust. The British put India directly under British rule and sent more troops to India and taxed Indians to pay for the cost of occupying forces there. All right, British colonial rule as of 1858. A parliament is set up as a system of colonial rule right in India. Okay, the British are going to build roads, improve railroads. They're going to flood India with machine-made textiles, ruining India's hand weaving industry that they had previously had before the British got there. Britain transforms their agriculture, changes the things that they're farming. They provide better health care, increased food production, um, population growth rises there, and they revise their legal system. British rule also brought peace and order to the countryside, which was once fighting. Upper class Indians sent their sons to British schools. So there's a lot of ups and downs to British colonial. Take a look at this map. It shows the year 1858 and the amount of British rule in India. The dark red is 1765. Okay, and as you can see, by the time 1858 rolls around, the pink is the area that British rules. They pretty much take over all of India. Okay, including parts even outside India over here. The Indian National Congress is going to form in 1885. Their goal is to educate Indians, predominantly Hindu Indians, and demand increasing equality and self-government for these people, which basically means get the British out of there. India becomes independent, its own country, not until 1946 after World War II. There was a very different view on the cultures of Indians and the British during the age of imperialism. The Indian attitude was that there was some educated Indians were impressed by British power and technology and urged India to follow a Western model of progress. Okay, they liked the things that the British are bringing to them. Other Indians felt the answer to change lay within their own Hindu or Muslim cultures. Okay, they like their beliefs and their traditions there, and they didn't want to be influenced by these Western nations. British attitude was most British knew little about Indian achievements and dismissed Indian culture with contempt. They didn't care about Indian culture whatsoever. A few British admired Indian theology and philosophy and respected Indians' ancient heritage. And our last slide on Indian nationalism. The British believed that Western educated Indians would form an elite class which would bolster British rule. As it turned out, exposure to European ideas had the opposite effect. By the late 1800s, Western educated Indians were spearheading a nationalist movement. In 1885, nationalist leaders organized the Indian National Congress. Its members looked forward to eventual self-rule, but supported Western-style modernization. In 1906, Muslims formed the Muslim League to pursue their own goals, including a separate Muslim state, which they would eventually get in the state of Pakistan. So you can see by the end of this year, India, just like China and just like Africa, is going to be taken over by Great Britain and other foreign nations, and there's going to be severe consequences and people who even try to rebel against this. Again, these rebellions are typically crushed because of the power of the imperialist countries, and the natives there are severely harmed, and the culture is lost that they once had, and again, they are suffering severely because of this.